From New York City, the epicenter of the coronavirus epidemic, this is Democracy Now!
Now, at this point, our cases in New York City constitute about 54% of the total in the state of New York, and about 32%, almost a third of the cases in the United States of America.
As New York hospitals see a surge in coronavirus cases, medical workers report growing shortages of protective gear. A nurse who tested positive after treating patients with the highly contagious disease has died. We'll get an update from a New York City emergency room doctor, Craig Spencer, who's also a survivor of Ebola, which he contracted while fighting its outbreak in Africa. Then Senator presidential candidate Bernie Sanders successfully fought to strengthen assistance to laid-off workers in the $2 trillion emergency relief bill passed by the Senate, even as he warned about the bill's corporate bailout fund.
I am very, very, very concerned about a $500 billion that will go out to the corporate world without, let me underline, without the accountability and transparency that is needed.
And as the coronavirus pandemic continues to spread around the world, we'll look at India, which is now under the largest lockdown in human history, with 1.3 billion people ordered to shelter in place. We'll speak with Amitav Ghosh, author of The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United States Senate has voted unanimously to approve a record-shattering $2.2 trillion emergency relief package to battle the unprecedented economic shock of the coronavirus pandemic. The House of Representatives is set to vote on the bill Friday, and President Trump has promised to sign it as soon as it reaches his desk. The bailout package would massively expand unemployment benefits, providing laid-off workers up to 100% of their salary and health insurance benefits for 4 months. Freelancers and gig economy workers would be eligible for unemployment benefits for the first time ever. Over $300 billion would go toward direct cash payments to most Americans, with one-time checks of $1,200 for adults and $500 per child. States and municipalities would receive $150 billion in direct aid. Companies would receive $221 billion in tax benefits. $117 billion would fund hospitals and the veterans' health care. And a $500 billion fund would provide loans and loan guarantees for corporations. Vermont Senator, presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, who successfully fought to strengthen the bill's assistance to laid-off workers, voted yes, even as he warned about the bill's corporate bailout.
We do not need, at this moment in history, to provide a massive amount of corporate welfare to large, profitable corporations. I think, as many of you are aware, you have industries like the airlines industries, among others, that have provided for stock buybacks, billions and billions of dollars for stock buybacks. They spent all their cash rewarding themselves and their stockholders. And lo and behold, today, they need a major bailout.
The vote on Wednesday evening was 96-0, with 4 senators absent. Just minutes before the roll call, Republican Senator John Thune announced he was feeling ill, would return to his home in South Dakota to self-quarantine. 3 other senators were also absent due to the coronavirus. Rand Paul of Kentucky, who's tested positive. Utah Senators Mike Lee and Mitt Romney, who are in self-quarantine. Here in New York City, the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak in the United States, hospitals are seeing the same surge in cases that overwhelmed healthcare systems in China, Italy, and Spain. Refrigerated trucks and tents have been stationed outside some hospitals to hold the bodies of the dead as morgues fill up. In just 24 hours on Tuesday, 13 people reportedly died at Elmhurst Hospital Center in Queens. New York City is reporting 366 26 deaths and over 33,000 confirmed cases, though the number of cases of infection is likely far, far higher due to a critical lack of tests. More than 4,000 coronavirus patients have been hospitalized in New York, where a leaked FEMA briefing shows all 1,800 intensive care beds in the city are expected to be full by Friday. We'll have more on the healthcare crisis here in New York City after headlines when we speak to Dr. Craig Spencer, Director of Global Health and Emergency Medicine at Columbia University Medical Center, who himself suffered from Ebola when he treated people in Africa. Across the United States, new coronavirus infections continued to increase exponentially, with 13,000 newly confirmed cases reported Wednesday, pushing the nationwide total above 68,000. Over 1,000 people have died in the United States. Louisiana, with one of the fastest infection rates in the world, marked its largest one-day increase, bringing its toll to 65 dead and nearly 2,000 infected. In neighboring Mississippi, Republican Governor Tate Reeves defied calls for an emergency stay-at-home order, declaring Mississippi is never going to be China. The Washington Post reports 140 U.S. nursing homes have recorded at least one coronavirus case. The Pentagon's ordered a 60-day freeze on troop movements overseas, with at least 415 Pentagon employees testing positive for coronavirus. Attorney General William Barr has directed federal prosecutors to charge anyone deliberately spreading or threatening to spread coronavirus with terrorism. Meanwhile, Amazon says it'll keep its massive fulfillment centers open amidst a surge of online orders after workers in at least 8 Amazon warehouses around the United States tested positive for COVID-19. In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, hundreds of sanitation workers held a wildcat strike Wednesday, demanding more protection from the virus. This is one of the workers, Sheldon White.
We want better equipment, protective gear. We have no masks. We want hazard pay. Hazard pay is very important. Why? Because we have high co-payments on any type of bill. We risk our life. Every time we grab a garbage bag, there can be a needle or something in there.
Tony Award-winning playwright Terrence McNally has died in Florida of complications from COVID-19. McNally's career spans 6 decades, included celebrated productions like Kiss of the Spider-Woman, Love, Valor, Compassion. Terrence McNally, openly gay writer whose plays tackled issues of love, homophobia, and the HIV/AIDS crisis. He was 81 years old. Celebrated chef Floyd Cardoz has died from a coronavirus infection. Cardoz was the first chef born and raised in India to head a major dining kitchen in New York City, Tabla. In the Dominican Republic, acclaimed fashion designer Jenny Polanco has died from complications of COVID-19. Polanco's career spanned 4 decades. She was a regular fixture at Miami Fashion Week. In Geneva, Switzerland, the Director General of the World Health Organization urged world leaders to take strong actions to end the scourge of coronavirus sweeping the globe as global confirmed cases approach 500,000.
We have overcome many pandemics and crises before. We will overcome this one too. The question is how large a price we will pay. Already, we have lost more than 16,000 lives. We know we will lose more. How many more will be determined by the decisions we make and the actions we take now.
In Italy, the nation currently hardest hit by the pandemic, the death toll has topped 7,500. But for the 4th straight day, the pace of new coronavirus cases fell, raising hopes that a nationwide lockdown is beginning to flatten the curve of infections. Spain announced 738 coronavirus new deaths Wednesday, surpassing China's death toll with over 3,600 fatalities. In China, authorities have lifted restrictions on millions of residents of Hubei province the original epicenter of the pandemic, although the provincial capital, Wuhan, remains on lockdown. Chinese officials say new cases of COVID-19 have all but stopped in Hubei, but some observers question that assessment and fear a potential second wave of cases. In cities across India, police are using violence to crack down on curfew violators, beating and whipping anyone flouting a nationwide lockdown for 1.3 billion people. Viral videos showed Indian police forcing groups of men to do squats and push-ups as punishment. India's bus and train services have been cancelled, creating a crisis for thousands of migrant workers trapped in big cities. There are widespread reports of hoarding, raising fears of shortage of food, medicine and supplies. We'll have more on India's coronavirus crisis later in the broadcast. In Kosovo, lawmakers ousted Prime Minister Albin Kurti in a no-confidence vote Wednesday over his refusal to declare a state of emergency. In Chile, with over 1,000 confirmed cases, large parts of the capital, Santiago, will go into lockdown to slow the spread of the virus. Earlier this month, fears over the pandemic ended 5 months of large-scale protests demanding the resignation of President Sebastián Piñera. In Stockholm, Sweden, 17-year-old climate activist Greta Thunberg said she is very likely has COVID-19 and has since recovered. Thunberg said she experienced a very mild illness while her father Svante experienced much more intense symptoms. In New Zealand, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern asked her nation's 5 million residents to behave as though they were contagious as a sweeping nationwide remain-at-home policy came into effect Thursday night.
If you have any questions about what you can or can't do and you're looking for answers, apply a simple principle. Act like you have COVID-19. Every move you make could be a risk to someone else.
Ardern's plea came on the same day the white supremacist terrorist who massacred Muslim worshippers in 2 New Zealand mosques last March pleaded guilty to the murder of 51 people. His sentencing trial will be delayed until New Zealand's COVID-19 epidemic is under control and family members of the victims have a chance to attend. Senator Bernie Sanders has challenged former Vice President Joe Biden to a 12th and final debate next month, signaling he'll continue to compete for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination. The Democratic National Committee has yet to schedule a date or a broadcast partner for an April debate, and on Wednesday, Biden dismissed the idea.
My focus is just dealing with this crisis right now. I haven't thought about any more debates. I think we've had enough debates. I think we should get on with this.
Meanwhile, The Intercept is reporting that the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, set up to help survivors of rape and sexual assault, refused to fund a Me Too investigation into an allegation against Joe Biden. The charges were brought by Tara Reid, who worked as a staff assistant for then-Senator Biden in 1993 when she was in her mid-20s. Reid told journalist Katie Halper in an interview published Tuesday that Biden repeatedly touched her without her consent and sexually assaulted her. A warning to listeners and viewers, her account is graphic.
And then his hands were on me and underneath my clothes. And, and then he went down my skirt, but then up inside it. And he penetrated me with his fingers.
Reid approached the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund in January looking for assistance, but was reportedly told the fund could not help her because Biden is a candidate for federal office and pursuing a case could jeopardize the fund's nonprofit status. The Intercept reports the public relations firm representing Time's Up Legal Defense Fund is SKD Knickerbocker, whose managing director, Anita Dunn, is top advisor to Biden's presidential campaign. At the White House, President Donald Trump Wednesday repeated his call for the United States to reopen for business on April 12th, Easter Sunday, around the time the coronavirus crisis is expected to peak in New York City. Trump's call for packed churches across the U.S. in mid-April came as Pope Francis ordered bishops around the world to instruct Catholics to celebrate Easter in their homes. Trump's plan also defies the entire medical establishment, which is pleading with Americans to remain at home to prevent new COVID-19 patients from overwhelming the healthcare system. Researchers at the Imperial College of London estimate without measures like lockdowns and social distancing, 2.2 million people in the United States will die of COVID-19. And in a major victory for environmentalists and indigenous water protectors, a federal judge ruled Wednesday the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers violated the National Environmental Policy Act when it permitted construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. The court ruled the Corps failed to resolve concerns by the Standing Rock Sioux about the potential impacts of oil spills and ordered the Trump administration to prepare a full environmental impact statement on the pipeline. Standing Rock Sioux Tribal Chair Mike Faith celebrated the ruling, writing, "It's humbling to see how actions we took 4 years ago to defend our ancestral homeland continue to inspire national conversations about how our choices ultimately affect this planet. Perhaps in the wake of this court ruling, the federal government will begin to catch on too," he said. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from New York City, the epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic in the United States. And my dear co-host Nermeen Sheikh is joining us from self-isolation in New York City. Nermeen, we are so close and yet so far.
Thank you so much, Amy. We are indeed living in an extraordinary moment in the city. I'd like to welcome our listeners and viewers both here in the country as well as around the world, many of whom are in the same position as I am, namely in self-isolation or in quarantine, or as we just mentioned, in India, a country of 1.3 billion people, under curfew. And, you know, even as we're reporting now on how difficult the situation is in New York City hospitals, the health system being completely overwhelmed by the number of cases, it's difficult not to think of places around the world, in Africa, in Asia, which have been referred to as a ticking time bomb, that COVID-19 may strike there, and where healthcare systems are so much weaker, what the effects of this lethal pandemic might be. Amy. That's right. And we're going to talk about India later in the broadcast, the largest lockdown on people ever in the world. And we're going to talk about issues like climate change and how it relates to the pandemic. But we're going to begin right here in New York City, the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak in the United States. Hospitals seeing the same surge in coronavirus cases that overwhelmed healthcare systems in China, Italy, and Spain. Refrigerated trucks and tents have been stationed outside of some hospitals to hold the bodies of the dead as morgues fill up. In 24 hours on Tuesday, 13 people reportedly died at Elmhurst Hospital Center, a 545-bed public hospital in the borough of Queens. The New York Times reports, quote, "In several hours on Tuesday, Dr. Ashley Bray performed chest compressions at Elmhurst Hospital Center on a woman in her 80s, a man in his 60s, and a 38-year-old who reminded the doctor of her fiancé. All had tested positive for the coronavirus and had gone into cardiac arrest. All eventually died. Dr. Bray called the situation apocalyptic. New York City is reporting 366 deaths and more than 33,000 confirmed cases, almost half of all the cases in the United States, though the number is expected to be so much higher due to the lack of tests. More than 4,000 coronavirus patients have been hospitalized in New York City. A leaked FEMA briefing shows all the more than 1,800 intensive care beds in the city are expected to be full by Friday, and the state has called for tens of thousands more ventilators, hospital beds, and intensive care beds. This comes as workers at New York City hospitals report shortages of personal protective equipment as they work amidst patients with the highly contagious disease. Workers for the massive Mount Sinai health system shared photos online of themselves wearing trash bags for protection. A New York City nurse who was treating coronavirus patients has died after testing positive about 2 weeks ago. Mount Sinai West nursing manager Caius Jordan Kelly was in her 40s, and his co-workers described him as a compassionate, devoted to his patients. For more, we're joined by Dr. Craig Spencer. He's Director of Global Health and Emergency Medicine at Columbia University Medical Center. Dr. Spencer contracted Ebola while fighting its outbreak in Africa and survived the disease. He's now an emergency room doctor in New York City,
where he's treating coronavirus patients. He's also on the board of Doctors Without Borders. And again, with us, our co-host Nermeen Sheikh. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Dr. Craig Spencer, describe a day in the New York City hospitals. We just laid out this graphic picture of shortage. And the question is, how unnecessary was this? The idea that in this country, the richest in the world, doctors, people like you and nurses and the staff of the hospitals going to those who even clean the hospitals do not have access to the necessary protection to treat the patients that are surging into these hospitals.
Thanks for having me on and let me share the story. Look, it's pretty dire inside New York City hospitals right now, and we're all concerned about how that's going to spread throughout the rest of the country, and more frankly, the rest of the world. It's no surprise that the greatest number of cases are being reported in the places with the strongest or the best healthcare systems. We know that cases are spreading all over the world. We're just picking them up more here, and we're seeing a lot more of the complications inside of our emergency departments. As has already been reported, we have a growing number of patients coming in every day with coronavirus. We have people young and old with complications, without complications, who get put on mechanical ventilators, who get put on life support to help their breathing, who have cardiac arrest. It's a daily reality for many of my colleagues on the front line, especially here in New York City.
Nermeen.
I'd like to ask you, Dr. Spencer, I mean, one of the things, as Amy mentioned, that's very striking is that, you know, the U.S. is, of course, extremely wealthy, the wealthiest country in the world. But it also has, according to the Global Health Security Index, in 2019, the U.S. was the highest ranked country in terms of pandemic preparedness. The U.S. was the best prepared. So if American hospitals are being overwhelmed in this way, what about all of the other countries that don't have the resources that the U.S. does? Yeah, I think if you asked anyone over the past couple of years, whether anyone that does this for a living, whether or not the U.S. was prepared for a pandemic, we all would have said no. I think all of us have written articles in the past couple of years lamenting the fact that the U.S. has torn apart the preparedness architecture here in the U.S. by underfunding the CDC, by underfunding state and local departments of health. It's not surprising to anyone that's been looking at this or been worrying about this over the past couple of years that this pandemic is wreaking such havoc here in the U.S. We've also, drastically underfunded the World Health Organization, despite the lessons we learned in West Africa in 2014 to 2016 with the Ebola crisis there. We learned that having preparedness was much more important than a reactive response. We learned that putting the right amount of funding into the organizations who are capable of picking up these disease threats and responding to them all over the world is the only way to protect people everywhere. It is so much cheaper. To invest in preparedness than it is to scramble for response. We're putting together trillions of dollars to try and respond to this just here in the United States. And that amount of money would have provided for global preparedness for over a decade. And so we need to really think about our priorities. And I hope when we come out on the other side of this, we think about where the smart investment is. A smart investment is not just trying to build a wall around this country and with the hope that we're going to keep microbes and bacteria out. The reality of our world right now is that wherever a disease starts, and it's more likely to be in China than it is to be in Columbia, Missouri, it can be with anywhere in the world within 24 to 48 hours, and we are all at risk unless we have strong health systems in the places where the most vulnerable patients are. And Dr. Spencer, can you explain for people who don't know people think, in the U.S., most healthcare is privatized. So why is it that in private hospitals, there isn't sufficient personal protective equipment, because not funding the CDC or cutting funding to the CDC, et cetera, shouldn't impact the decisions that private hospitals make about the equipment, the beds, et cetera, that they acquire? Yeah.
It's funny because we talk about these N95 masks. Those are those thicker variants that filter particles like the coronavirus. And generally, we're fit tested in the hospital every year. It's a requirement to make sure that they fit right, that nothing can get through. We almost never use them because in the U.S., we don't have relatively many tuberculosis patients. We don't have a lot of people where we have to use this type of protection. That's not the reality in many of the places that I work, West Africa, East Africa, Southeast Asia, et cetera. They're just more used to a lot of the communicable diseases that we have stopped seeing as much here in the United States. The result is that a lot of my colleagues don't have the same amount of experience of working with the personal protective equipment that we need right now. I see a lot of people who are, touching the mask or putting it on or taking it off incorrectly. Personal protective equipment like gloves and masks do not protect you if they're used incorrectly. One of the greatest risks when you're using them is taking them off wrong, touching your face, touching the mask, and infecting yourself. So it's not surprising that we don't have a huge supply of these things. We didn't prepare for this scenario. And I think this is the most important message. So many people knew that this was coming. So many people knew that this was coming. You can look back and you can see headlines from 3 months ago, 3 years ago. Everything that we learned in West Africa seemed to have been torn apart in decisions that, seemingly undermine our willingness and our ability to respond to pandemics, not only here in the United States, but throughout the world.
Dr. Spencer, if you would take us on your personal journey, what happened to you when you were dealing with Ebola in Africa, about contracting it? And then the lessons we can learn, and I want to particularly go to the issue of the egregious lack of tests and how that is a major public health care measure, just for people to understand. The lack of tests, how the lag in getting them, and then even now the amount of time it takes for people. It can be 4, 5, 10 days to find out. In fact, even if they get the test in New York, very difficult. And what that means in terms of contagion. But start with yourself contracting Ebola.
Yeah. So I worked in West Africa, in Guinea, in 2014. I was in Gekadu, another epicenter of an outbreak, providing direct clinical care on a daily basis in full personal protective equipment with Doctors Without Borders. And I followed rigorous protocols every single day. My organization had been doing this for decades and had really done a great job in minimizing the risk to the providers and increasing the quality of care we could provide to our patients. That being said, personal protective equipment is not flawless. It's not perfect, even if used perfectly. At one point, I was infected. When I came back to the U.S., I was thankfully treated here and received incredible quality care and was lucky enough to survive, largely because I was treated in a really great health system. I was also really young and didn't have any of the medical issues, but the whole time, the only thing I could think about were my colleagues and my friends back in West Africa that didn't have access to the same quality of care. One thing I say is that in West Africa, I took care of about 30 patients myself at any time. And here in the U.S., I probably had 30 providers on call to take care of me at any time. Some of the stunning similarities and differences between West Africa and coronavirus is that, they're both viruses. The coronavirus seems to infect more people and kill a relatively smaller percent versus Ebola. But the difference in terms of the fight was that in West Africa, I at least never really had to worry about my personal protective equipment. A lot of my colleagues here in New York City are worried about the number of N95 respirators we have, how limited our supply chain is, and if it's bad here, what's it going to look like in the rest of the country. And you bring up another really important point that we haven't talked about, I think, enough, and that is this issue of testing. Right now, we're talking about only testing certain people. So only testing some healthcare workers, only testing people that are hospitalized. It's not because that's the best thing to do. It's because that's really the only thing we can do right now. Testing capacity has increased dramatically in the past couple of weeks, but we are months delayed. We should have had a testing strategy like South Korea. We need to understand where this disease is passing, where it's transmitting. And the only way to do that is to test, and test. We haven't been doing that. We've all been limited in our hospitals and in our communities. People are walking around now not knowing whether or not they've had coronavirus, whether they may have some type of immunity, whether they could be out in our communities helping other people if they have antibodies. by delivering groceries to the elderly or helping in other institutions. So our testing strategy right now is such because we've failed to be prepared. There were critical missteps in the testing capacity and the testing kits that were sent out. There were a lot of promises about our ability to do millions of beautiful tests for anyone that wanted one. But that was never the reality on the front line, and that's completely changed in the past couple of weeks.
So, Dr. Craig Spencer, if you could talk about the use of it as a public health measure that you understand, and now, as a result, everyone must treat themselves as if they're contagious, as if they're infected to protect others in the community. And yet you have President Trump, if you can respond to what he is saying, that by Easter, right, in just a few weeks, he wants to see packed churches while the Pope at the Vatican is telling people to wash their hands but not wash the feet of the worshipers. Well, he is saying pray at home. Of course, he's in Italy, which is so hard hit, and many are deeply concerned that the U.S. could go that route. What would stop us from going that route? And talk about the danger of President Trump's message.
Yeah, I think in a week we will be Italy, at least here in New York City. We're already seeing that. This is something I've been warning about for weeks. This is something Italy has been warning us about for weeks. In terms of what can stop this, I don't want to incite any panic. I want to incite some kind of preparation, because we still have, a huge country outside of New York City and the other epicenters right now that will be impacted by this virus in the coming weeks, in the coming months. Look, to respond to that, let me just say that the first case of coronavirus was diagnosed here in New York City in early March, so just over 3 weeks ago. Easter is, just a couple weeks away, 2 to 3 weeks away. The idea that we can have this dramatic spike in cases, which is still going up, by the way, and that we're somehow going to level off and be at a place where by Easter we're going to have people back together again, is dangerous and magical thinking. It defies all of the modeling that we've seen. It defies any of the reality any of my colleagues are seeing in the emergency department. And quite frankly, going into work and seeing coronavirus patients and seeing them crash and decompensate and get really sick really quickly is scary. But this idea of millions and millions of my fellow Americans all being in church or being in concert halls or being together in just a couple weeks gives me such pause, knowing that this is the only way the virus can infect you. It cannot infect you if it cannot meet you. And by bringing people back together, this is the greatest possible risk we have to continuing and worsening this pandemic, fueling the flame across the United States. The most important message everyone needs to know right now is the only way that you can be safe is by staying home. The virus cannot infect you if it does not meet you. The streets may look empty, I know, but I assure you what's happening within the walls of the emergency departments here in New York City, and maybe next week in Newark and a week after that in New Mexico, it is anything but the quietness and the calm you see on those empty city streets.
Finally, Dr. Craig Spencer, what keeps you going? I mean, you, your colleagues, all of the health staff of all of the hospitals in this country and around the world are so incredibly brave. You are the hardest hit. What gets you to that hospital every day?
I think it's what we do. It's our moral obligation. Yeah, we want to do it with the right equipment. Yeah, we want to do it with the right tools. But I think all of us have the sense of personal drive to be able to provide care. This is what I feel, and this is what all of my colleagues have felt, all the national staff I worked with in Guinea in 2014 and 2015. I remember just being so moved by their willingness and ability to come to work every single day, despite their communities being destroyed by a virus. And I've learned so much from them, so much that's prepared me for this outbreak, so much that I've tried to share with my colleagues now. And I think we really need to be thinking about the fact that, yes, the U.S. is really hard hit, and it's going to get worse in the next couple of weeks. But let us not forget that there is a world outside of these borders. I have worked in a lot of places where not just the critical care doctors are in short supply, but there may be no critical care beds. There may be no ventilators. there may be no ICUs or ability to provide the higher quality care that we're talking about right here in the United States. So it's just a good reminder that the media is focused so much on what's happening in New York City, but I assure you that this is an issue and will be a greater issue everywhere else in the world. And just make sure we all keep everybody else in our thoughts.
Dr. Craig Spencer, I want to thank you so much for being with us, Director of Global Health and Emergency Medicine at Columbia University Medical Center, speaking to us from his home, where he also remarkable in his work with doctors Without Borders and many other groups as he spends his time having been in Africa and now in New York City. When we come back, we'll hear the words of Senator and presidential candidate Bernie Sanders on the record-shattering $2.2 trillion emergency relief bill passed by the Senate last night. Stay with us.
The bad news is that everyone is a potential victim. But the good news is that everyone is a potential solution. Sensitize the masses to sanitize. Keep a social distance and quarantine. Stop! The coronavirus is sweeping over mankind. Everybody must be alert. It's a global pandemic we can never take for granted. Kila mtu must be alert. It's a matter of life we can never take for granted. Discipline and personal hygiene, and make sure you regularly wash your hands. Keep a distance from everyone. Report anything like a symptom. Serious fever is a symptom. Dry cough is a symptom. Walkway tamula is a symptom. Itchy eyes and flu is a symptom.
Coronavirus alert by Ugandan pop star Bobi Wine and Nubian Lee. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. In a historic vote just before midnight, the Senate unanimously approved a record-shattering $2.2 trillion emergency relief bill to battle the unprecedented economic shock of the coronavirus pandemic. The House is set to vote on the bill on Friday. President Trump promises to sign it immediately. In live-stream legislative update Wednesday night, Vermont Senator, presidential candidate Bernie Sanders spoke about who the bill will help.
This package provides the largest expansion of unemployment benefits in American history, an increase of over $250 billion. Under this bill, average Americans who have been furloughed will be able to receive up to 100% of their salary and their health insurance for 4 months. For 4 months. Weekly unemployment benefits will increase by $600. So if you were laid off, your unemployment benefit will increase by $600 above what it otherwise would have been. And right now, the average benefit is about $364 for workers. Now, also, very importantly, this expansion of unemployment will include part-time workers. It will include gig workers, like those who drive Uber cars. It will include tip workers and the self-employed, who would otherwise not be covered by unemployment insurance. So in other words, what we're doing now is at a time when fewer than half of the American people would normally be covered by unemployment. What this legislation does, it expands it to the overall workforce, and on top of that, for many workers would provide $600 a week more than they otherwise would have gotten. And that is one of the more important provisions in the bill. In addition, this bill provides $250 billion to go out in one-time checks of $1,200 for adults and $500 for kids. Now, let me be very honest, as some of you may know, I wanted much more. I wanted every American family to be able to receive $2,000 every single month that we continue to exist within the crisis. So this does not do that. And this is clearly not enough to me, but that is what it is.
That's Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders speaking Wednesday night about the unprecedented $2.2 trillion emergency relief bill. The legislation would also provide $150 billion in direct aid to states and municipalities, more than $220 billion in tax benefits to companies, almost $120 billion in aid to hospitals and for veterans' health care, and a $500 billion fund to provide loans and loan guarantees for corporations. Senator Sanders and other progressive critics are sounding the alarm over the corporate bailout portion of the bill and its limited oversight measures.
I am very, very, very concerned about a $500 billion that will go out to the corporate world without, let me underline, without the accountability and transparency that is needed. We do not need, at this moment in history, to provide a massive amount of corporate welfare to large, profitable corporations. I think, as many of you are aware, you have industries like the airlines industries, among others, that have provided for stock buybacks, billions and billions of dollars for stock buybacks. They spent all their cash rewarding themselves and their stockholders. And lo and behold, today, they need a major bailout. So the concern here is, A, do we trust the Trump administration to effectively decide which company will get the loans or the grants? The answer is no, I do not. Do we think that these loans and grants during a political season will be used to benefit the president's election prospects? Absolutely, I do.
That's presidential candidate Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders speaking Wednesday night in Washington, D.C. In this breaking news, U.S. unemployment claims have soared to 3.3 million claims last week, quadrupling the record from 1982. When we come back, we turn to India, which is now under the largest lockdown in human history. Stay with us.
Tinny, lend me your pony to keep company with mine. Tinny, lend me your pony to keep company with mine. 'Cause my pony's gone running down the track. My pony's gone wild. My pony's gone running down the track. My pony's gone wild. Tinny, lend me your rooster to keep company with mine. Tinny, lend me your rooster to keep company with mine. 'Cause my rooster's gone crowing for the day. My rooster's gone wild. My rooster's gone crowing for the day. My rooster's gone wild. Tinny, lend me your crocodile to keep company with mine. Tinny, lend me your crocodile to keep company.
That was Sophia Blum and Jess Regelson from Providence, Rhode Island, singing their rendition of Tinny by Ronnie Arbo and Daisy Mayhem, which they dedicated to their nephew and grandchildren, who they haven't seen because of self-isolation in the midst of this pandemic. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman in the studio with Nermeen Sheikh in self-isolation in New York City. We're turning to India now, where Prime Minister Narendra Modi ordered the largest lockdown in human history starting Wednesday, telling the country's 1.3 billion people to shelter in place. With 693 confirmed coronavirus cases and 13 dead, India's 3-week lockdown is an attempt to stave off the skyrocketing death tolls and overwhelmed health systems already seen in China, Italy, Spain, and now the United States. But as the country's economy and daily life comes to an abrupt halt, hundreds of millions of Indians who live hand-to-mouth have been left without the means to support their families. More than 80% of India's workforce is informal, with most living off daily wages, often less than $2 or $3 a day, wages they cannot earn under the present curfew. Some states, including Uttar Pradesh and Kerala, have announced economic relief packages for workers and the poor, and Modi's government is expected to do the same in the coming days. But critics say Modi's response to the coronavirus crisis has left India's poor to fend fend for themselves, with migrant workers left stranded at now closed train and bus stations with no way to get home, and millions wondering how they'll survive weeks and potentially months without work. Meanwhile, India's testing lags far behind other nations, leading to fears the actual number of COVID-19 infections is far, far higher than reported. As of Tuesday, India had conducted only 15,000 tests, 15,000 in a nation of 1.3 billion. Well, for more, we're joined by the award-winning Indian writer Amitav Ghosh, joining us from his home in Brooklyn, New York, where he is sheltering in place. His books include Gun Island and The Great Derangement, Climate Change, and the Unthinkable. Thanks so much for being with us. Let's start with what's happening in India. Let's talk about this largest lockdown in human history. What do you understand is going on, Amitav?
Well, it seems to be a very chaotic situation. Let me say, first of all, that one of the terrible things about this lockdown is that it should have happened a lot earlier. I mean, I've been self-isolating here in Brooklyn for almost 3 weeks now. And I talk to my friends and my family every day back in India. And really, for 3 weeks, they were just not taking this seriously at all. And those signals have to come from the government. For example, Floyd Cardoz, I'm told, he was a friend of mine. I'm really devastated to hear about his passing. But I'm told he had a huge party in Bombay, earlier this month. And, if they had shut down these sort of big gatherings and so on 2 to 3 weeks ago, it would have served an enormous purpose, but they didn't. And so this lockdown has come as a huge surprise. My family back in Calcutta, they're completely panicked because they didn't have time to go out and, buy food or anything. So, and, that's, I'm just talking about my family. As for, the 80% of India's employment is in the informal sector, and those people are just completely devastated. You showed a picture of people being beaten by the police. A lot of informal workers are now out on the streets. They lived on the streets anyway. They have no way to get back to their homes, which are maybe, hundreds of miles away. They're just stuck on the street. Yesterday, I saw a horrifying video of a young boy being beaten by the police. And he was just out on the street for, because there was he had nowhere to go. You see these pictures of, workers carrying their children on their heads, trying to walk back hundreds of miles, to their families. It's just a shocking situation.
And Amitav Ghosh, what do you expect will happen now? What are you learning from your family? Because at the moment, this lockdown is supposed to last for 3 weeks. What are you hearing, though, about how long it's likely to continue beyond that, and also what provisions the Modi government has put in place, if any, for people under curfew to get access to even basic goods, food, drinking water, etc.?
Well, the government has announced some sorts of relief measures, and it varies from state to state in India. So Kerala has actually been very proactive, and they, acted very early amongst the Indian states. How effective these measures will be, I just don't know. Even delivery workers are being beaten by the police. It just makes absolutely no sense. The journalists trying to get to work are being beaten by the police. Healthcare workers are being beaten. So, as far as I can see, it's kind of this strange situation of chaos and panic building upon each other. So, middle-class families like mine are able to, stockpile a certain amount of food at home. But you think of the people who are stuck in tiny shanties, who have really not the ability to even stockpile any food. And the weather's turning hotter and hotter. They're stuck inside. It's just, it's just going to be appalling for them. And let me say straight away that, the reported numbers, we just cannot trust at all. We know now that really the numbers reported are a function of the testing. And as Amy said earlier, very few Indians have been tested. It's like 15,000 in a huge country. So, again, another statistic that, is not at all trustworthy is the number of people who are dying, because a very large number of deaths in India are not actually reported, or they're not certified by doctors. So we really have no idea at all of what's going on the ground.
And Amitav, could you elaborate a little bit more? You've suggested here the extraordinary inequality in the effects and spread of this virus. Of course, here in the United States, but perhaps with different orders of magnitude in countries like India, with such a large, population that is poor. Who this virus is likely to impact the most, and the relationship between these decades of which you've pointed out, decades of neoliberalism and the populations that are going to be the most affected by this in India as well as here.
Well, the sort of neoliberal sorts of policies that we've seen around the world have had the effect of greatly increasing inequality, So, you see this terrible sort of cycle. I mean, a lot of the informal workers in Delhi are actually farmers from areas that have been very badly hit by climate change. In 2016, for example, there was a terrible drought in central India. Hundreds of thousands of people were leaving their villages every single day and flocking into cities like Delhi, where they lived under flyovers. So what are those people going to do in this circumstance? How can they even return? Again, obviously, people live in very close contact in slums, in shanty towns. It's going to spread very, very fast over there. Those people are not going to be able to get themselves tested. They're not going to be able to go to hospitals. In any case, at this point in time, I suspect hospitals are going to be the prime center for the transmission of this disease. We are seeing that around the world. There's no reason to believe that won't be the case in India. So yes, just take one example. I mean, during this last week, as the panic was beginning to spread in India, migrant workers started piling into trains in thousands. You can imagine in a small train compartment how quickly this will spread.
If you could comment, Amitav Ghosh, on President Trump going to India right at the time that people were saying he had to be speaking about coronavirus, not only there, but dealing with what's happening in the United States as well. But instead, he was there at a stadium being celebrated, not saying any word when it could have made such an enormous difference. And also talk more about, your book is titled The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. Very appropriate for what's happening right now. But if you could talk more deeply about the connection between climate change and the growth of these viruses, the spread of these viruses, and what we haven't taken seriously until this point.
Well, yes, you're right. I mean, just a few weeks ago, President Trump was in India with the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. They were in a huge stadium with tens of thousands of people. I think it was hundreds of thousands, actually. And, you can just sense that this is a huge incubator of the disease. Even a couple of weeks ago, there were massive cricket matches going on across India. It was just a spectacle of derangement. My book is called The Great Derangement, and every single day I see more and more signs of this kind of derangement. So, the relationship with climate change, well, as far as I can tell, obviously, one direct relationship is rising temperatures will make the transmission of certain kinds of diseases easier in certain places. But, I think we can't think of it only in terms of a causal relationship. I think these things, this pandemic, the global migration crisis, so many other things are actually all effects, of this great acceleration that we've been seeing for the last 30 years, since starting in about 1990, since we've had this sort of neoliberal regime, economic regime put in place across the world. Half of all the greenhouse gas emissions that are in the skies right now come since 1990. So it's exactly in this period that we've witnessed this incredible acceleration in travel, in mobility, all the things that make it possible for a pandemic like this to instantly, as it were, spread itself around the world.
And Amitav, can you speak specifically on the question of this great acceleration to the Modi government's policies specifically? I mean, a lot of people have criticized the Modi government for the way in which it imposed this curfew and compared it to his decision to demonetize the currency a couple of years ago. So could you talk about the impact of the Modi government's policies, both on the question of inequality and the impact on the climate crisis of some of the policies that the Modi government has pursued?
See, the lockdown announcement was made at 8 p.m. at night, and the demonetization announcement was also made in a similar way. And the demonetization announcement created absolute panic that lasted, for a long time, disrupted lives, and really rendered, the informal sector very, very vulnerable. They still have not recovered from that. So when when it was announced that the Prime Minister is going to make another sort of major announcement, already that created a kind of incredible panic. So, and apart from that, the last few months in India have been incredibly difficult. I mean, the government also announced a set of changes in citizenship laws, which has completely divided the country and created upheavals across the country. This couldn't, in fact, have happened at a worse moment. It's going to create a lot of uncertainty, a lot of panic going ahead. I don't think anyone can really foresee what lies ahead in the next few weeks, because I feel absolutely sure that 3 weeks is not enough. It's going to be much more than that. We are just seeing the beginnings of this pandemic in India. So the Modi government's policies from the start have been very anti-environmental. They've diluted the Forest Rights Act, which protected the rights of many forest-dwelling indigenous peoples. They've even diluted things like, in India we had strict regulations about building close to the sea, to the coast. There were strict regulations about leaving a certain amount of land that you couldn't build on. So obviously hotels, resorts, all those sorts of lobbies, they wanted that changed, and they were able to push through a change. You just think about this moment in time with sea level rise. And you're suddenly allowed to to build closer and closer to the sea. It's a kind of madness, And, especially the devastation that is happening in India's forests being opened up to mining interests across India. All of this is going to create absolute disaster, because we can see that, it's that kind of ecological destruction, it's deforestation that creates the conditions for these animal-to-human transmissions of viruses.
Amitav Ghosh, we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank you for being with us. Indian writer based in Brooklyn, where he's self-isolating, author of The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. And that does it for the show. We cannot end this broadcast without a moment of joy. And that joy is that it's Nermeen Sheikh's birthday. Nermeen, a very, very happy birthday. I wish you were right here at my side so you could blow out this candle with me. But you are so important in this broadcast and represent such an important ray of hope, as do all our colleagues here at Democracy Now!, both at the studio and self-isolating, but working so hard at home. Happy birthday, Nermeen. Happy birthday, dear Nermeen. Democracy Now! Is brought to you by a remarkably dedicated group of passionate producers, videographers. I'm Amy Goodman from New York City. Thanks so much.